time, we recognize that to some extent the federal government needs to be extended this power. Many have seen the Commerce Clause to be pouncing on or stepping on the Bill of Rights. And when we look at the Bill of Rights lays out all these liberties that we as individuals enjoy that we can ensure and feel confident that the federal government is not going to be able to take away from us. In Constitution USA, Gary Marbett talked about this with the buckaroo. However, because that buckaroo isn't necessarily confined to that state, because that product can easily flow over state lines, it becomes a conflict of interest to the federal government or to other states. So the federal government is trying to impose regulations and laws that doesn't necessarily coincide with, in this case, the state of Montana. Let's take a look at some legislation that at the time the federal government implemented and was quite controversial, but today we regard as necessary. The first is the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990. This is a civil rights law that prohibits discrimination on the basis of disability. And so it allows for individuals with disabilities to be able to still have access to jobs, to enjoy certain protections that are afforded to individuals on the basis of race, religion, sex, or national origin. It also ensures that public accommodations are made for individuals with disabilities. So when you go to a restaurant or you go to a department store or you go anywhere that's providing a public service, those accommodations need to be made so that individuals with disabilities are able to access those services. So just a formal recap, the Americans with Disabilities Act prohibits discrimination against people with disabilities in employment, transportation, public accommodation, communications, and governmental activities. The ADA also establishes requirements for telecommunications relay services. The next piece of legislation is the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 is a landmark piece of civil rights legislation in the United States that outlawed discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. It ended unequal application of voter registration requirements and racial segregation in schools, at the workplace, and by facilities that served the general public, known as public accommodations. In addition to civil rights legislation, we can also look at environmental regulation. When we look at the Environmental Protection Agency, that is the agency within the United States that ensures that regulations are respected among the states at the federal level. An example of a major piece of federal legislation when it comes to the environment is the Clean Air Act. The Clean Air Act is a United States federal law designed to control air pollution on a national level. Requires the Environmental Protection Agency to develop and enforce regulations to protect the public from airborne contaminants known to be hazardous to human health. The law requires regulatory control over air pollution. This is where I'm going to end the lecture discussing the bicameral legislature and why it looks the way that it does, and the expansion of federal power. We're going to talk about this in our discussion, so be prepared for some questions.